Hello, everybody. Welcome to another edition of the Mouthy Money podcast. I'm very excited today to have the one and only Chris Tuite back in my presence. Chris, hello.
Hi, Ed. How you doing?
Yeah, good. How are you, more importantly? Back from a couple of weeks of well-earned paternity leave, I believe.
Yeah. Second daughter has arrived, much trailed on this show. She has finally made her appearance, Rita. We're all tired but delighted, and thinking about personal finance issues that pertain to kids. So there might be a bit of that on this show later. But yeah, all good. Thank you. Pleased to be back.
Brilliant. Congratulations. Well, those of you who haven't heard Chris before, obviously he's head of consumer finance at MRM, and he joins me every week to discuss a multitude of different things. This week we've got we're going down a bit of a different kind of rabbit hole. There's a lot in the news at the moment about what's coming up in the budget, and it's a bit of a sort of momentous one. So we thought we'd go against the grain a little bit and talk about things that aren't coming in the budget, but are also still potentially important in terms of your personal finances. Now we're going to kick off. So these basically amount to a couple of things that the Labour government, the new Labour government, I guess you still call it, we're still in the early days, things that the Labour government are doing that could affect your personal finances. Now, the first one of these, and perhaps the one we know the most about, is renters reform. So, what's coming up and what's happening? Chris, what do you know about what's happening?
Well, it's been much trailed, this renters reform bill. I think they've changed it to the renters rights bill, which is very on brand for Labour. There's been a bit of kind of back and forth and consternation about this because the private rented sector is somewhat controversial, so we say. And there definitely room for improvement in certain areas, I think. But what you don't want to do is to exacerbate an already pretty major problem in terms of lack of availability of housing for people who are renting in the UK. So it's a bit of a delicate one for that reason. I think if certain people who might be renting properties are thinking, well, this needs to be a massive sledgehammer needs to be taken to this and it needs to be reformed completely. Whereas the flip side to that is that many private landlords, because of changes to the way that buy-to-let properties are taxed, and also the increased accountability in many ways that hoops they need to jump through in order to be landlords, has made it less attractive for many of the kind of hobbyist guys who came in and thought they'd buy a second property as a retirement option for some income, that kind of thing, for example. So it's been through a couple of guises, but the latest one I'm taking from Ruby Flanagan's account in the Mirror. And the main things that we need to be aware of is that no-fault evictions are going to be banned. So under Section 21 of the 1988 Housing Act, you used to be able to just evict somebody without giving them good reason, just providing them with 2 months' notice, and that's it, really. That's going to be abolished for both new and existing tenants, which obviously means that there'll be more secure tenancies, which must be a good thing. However, I think, and I've got personal experience of this myself with rental properties that are either side of where I live, actually, that can cause headaches if the people renting are acting antisocially or are damaging the property, etc., and it can make it harder for people to jump through those hoops. So, as always, there's kind of flip side to this, but I think generally it can only be a good thing. And in Ruby's article, she mentions that Section 21 evictions are a leading driver of homelessness, according to charities and campaigners. And the government said nearly 26,000 households needed council support to avoid homelessness after an eviction in the last year alone. And as we know, local councils are pretty much penniless as it stands, and but we do have a huge issue with lack of housing supply for people who are made homeless as well. So trying to avoid that can only be a good thing, I suppose. So that's one of the main things. The other thing is a ban on mid-tenancy rent hikes. I think that's pretty straightforward. That can only be a good thing. people should know what they're getting into when they sign up, and there should be an agreed contractual period, and everyone should know what they're paying and what they're entitled to off the back of that. So, those mid-tenancy rent hikes, that's naughty. I think that should be avoided at all costs. Labour's reforms are also going to give tenants strength of right to request having a pet. In fairness, I think the previous administration, the Tories, had said a similar thing. And again, I suppose it depends on your views on dogs, cats, snakes, tarantulas. But, as a cat owner myself, I think that's all right. And then there's kind of bidding wars. So there's this stuff at the start of tenancies where you kind of say, well, I was going to rent you the property, but someone's come in and offered 100 quid over the asking or 200 quid over the asking. All of a sudden, you find yourself paying over the odds for a property. They're going to put a stop to that because of the sort of chronic short supply. That demand has been allowed these practices to kind of take root. But actually, again, they're going to have to advertise what the rent costs and go from there, really. And there's also a ban on benefit discrimination, so no DSS. Has also been a thing previously, saying that people want benefits, they don't want them in there because of stereotypes about how they might behave when they're in their properties. So I think, again, that can only be a good thing. So there's some good things in there, I think, but what you need to be careful of is making sure that you don't sort of make it too onerous for landlords to offer their properties. So that can lead to problems.
Yeah, this is okay. So this is and I am no advocate for landlords, really. I've never been a landlord. I've had a couple of landlords in my life, and they were fine. They didn't treat me poorly. In fact, one of them was actually pretty good. My counterpoint to these things would be, and I kind of, in a vacuum, I understand why these things are all good. Like getting, it enhances protections for renters. Renting is a deeply insecure way to live, and it feels insecure. Other countries are much better at doing it. You look at countries like, Germany, where you rent a house and that's it. That's your place for life, kind of thing. You do what you like and that sort of stuff. I mean, we're looking at the stuff as it's changing. The Section 21, I think. I think that's probably the most complicated one to kind of square, because it's like, you can only tell from the inside of a landlord's head why they're evicting you, right? Are they evicting you just because they don't like you? Are they evicting you because they want to charge somebody else a higher price? Are they about to sell the property? All this kind of thing. And I think that's really complicated. I think for me, the other ones are more simple, though. So the challenging of rent increases, I think all that's going to lead to is rising rents are going to rise in the first place, because landlords think, okay, well, if I can't, get a rent increase after a year, then I need to just whack it up get as much as I can now, so I can live off that for 2 years until the tenancy comes up or whatever. The bidding wars thing is the same. Obviously, I think it's a completely noxious thing to do, to set a price or something and then have a bidding war and then be like, actually, I'm going to take this amount because somebody else offered it to me. Ha ha ha. I think that's terrible. But then I also think if you get rid of the bidding wars, then landlords are just going to put the price as high as they conceivably go. So actually, I think what some of this stuff is going to do is create like a new form of price discovery that's going to push rents up. I think it will make rents more expensive. That's just what's going to happen because of this stuff. And it maybe is like a one-off rental market price increase, and that it's like a necessary pain point that has to happen in order to increase the rights of of renters at large. And because, there's so many of them. But I think the short-term consequences are probably not going to be excellent. And then you look at other stuff like introducing decent home standards, which is great. And I think obviously you don't want people living in slums, but if you force landlords to spend thousands of pounds upgrading their houses, they're going to put the rents up to match that. And again, it probably has to happen, but it's going to be a consequence of improving the standards of the housing stock that we've got and that kind of thing. I think actually, and this is something I've read about previously, and this is a more out there theory, is actually what Labour and what is an optimal potential outcome for the rental market is the destruction of the rental market.
Right.
So you have no renters.
That reminds me of a quote that someone said in the Vietnam War: "We had to destroy the village in order to save it." So I'm
Yeah,
looking forward to.
exactly.
Okay,
No,
why are
okay,
we destroying the mental village?
okay,
Ed? Come on.
okay, so work with me here, Chris. Basically, and I know where I read this, and this is completely unsourced, and I need to try and dig it out. I might have seen it somewhere really questionable, like Reddit. But you know how you get like computer games like City Builders and stuff like that, where you have like a a big map of a city and you can build a city and all this kind of stuff.
Like SimCity.
SimCity
Is
type
that still
stuff,
a
yeah.
thing? Is that still a thing? Or am I
Yeah,
showing my
you
age
get like
again?
really
Yeah.
like you get really really like detailed ones now that even include things like rental markets. So you'll have like residential districts in a city in a sim city that includes a portion of rented properties, right? And you'd always have a situation where the city would grow and grow and grow, and then the economics of the city would totally collapse in and on itself. And these models are really cleverly built to mirror our own economies and cultures and societies as closely as possible to make them super, realistic. And what would always happen is you'd end up with a situation where property prices went up and up and up and up, and then you had a rental market where people couldn't afford it, and then you had labor shortages, and everything just created massive chaos. And then the person who did this experiment then experimented with ways of how you fix the problem of unaffordability and this kind of thing. And the answer to the solution that the computer found was to destroy the rental market, was to make being a landlord so expensive as to be impossible. Because
Right.
then you basically release all of the housing stock back into the market. Everybody buys a house because they're able to access that property because the market has collapsed. So basically, the solution to the problem was just get rid of the landlords, get rid of them completely, make it illegal, and that will fix it. That will fix the problem. I don't think Labour's going to do that,
No,
but
I don't. I think it might be a bit more complicated than that as
I
well.
might
To be
write it
fair,
on. I might
yeah.
write it on a postcard to Rachel Reeves and see what she thinks. I mean,
From
maybe.
from Maldi Money's Reddit correspondent, is that?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
we found this solution on SimCity 2000.
So that's my I'm going to try and have listeners. I'm going to try and put something in the show notes if I can find it, but I probably can't. So whatever. But here we are.
We'll make sure it's a secure link. No, it's an interesting point, and I mean, I don't think we should destroy the rental market. But I see where you're going with the economics of it, and that's why this is quite a delicate thing. Because, listen, renting is. Talking there about the landlords you had, I'm reminded, if you'll indulge me, of like the first property my now wife and I moved into. It was a nice place, small flat, nice garden, and after about sort of 3 months, Tanya started to develop this really awful cough that just wouldn't go away. I'm like, okay, something's not quite right here. What's going on? Bedroom's a bit cold. Pull out some furniture and the wall is covered in black mold, right? Which is dangerous, and there's another things that they're looking to kind of deal with. I remember phoning the landlord, and we're in the process of searching for our flat to buy, so we're kind of extending it over a period of time, the tenancy by a month here, a month there, and said to him, what are you guys going to do about this? And his response to me after a couple of days of thinking about it was, yeah, we can fix it, but I need you to contribute. Which I'm not sure if that's illegal, but it feels like it bloody should be, to be brutally honest. Like, if you're renting a house that is fundamentally dangerous, then that's on you to fix. And obviously, this person was not particularly that bothered about doing the right thing in this scenario. So some landlords do need to be compelled in that regard. But then I'm sure there are loads out there, and you talked about it as well, who are on the right side of the line of this, and just have these properties, renting them out to people in fair and above board means, but it's trying to create a bit more consistency around that is key, really, without creating unintended consequences that we come back to, where all of a sudden prices to rent somewhere are ridiculous and everybody's losing.
Yeah. So I think a few years ago, when the Tories really started tinkering in earnest with some of the tax treatment about how you can earn a living as a landlord, so they kind of took away some of the reliefs around like mortgage interest, and they did other stuff like you couldn't offset your mortgage against kind of the income tax and all this kind of stuff. I can't remember the specific details. Basically, they started making it a bit more difficult to be a landlord with one property. And actually, there was a lot of discussion about why that was being done. But what I understood from it at the time was what they actually wanted to do is they wanted to make, and I've referred to this earlier, they wanted to make the rental sector more German, because in Europe, renting is a much more normal thing. Home ownership, as we understand it, is quite a British or I guess American phenomenon as well. In Europe, renting your entire life is a fairly normal thing to do. And actually, in countries like Germany, landlords, as they exist, are actually much more professional, companies that will own properties portfolios and manage those property portfolios, and they will rent those properties out long term, and there's no kind of pressure, because we have this kind of rock and a hard place where you might have a landlord who it's a second home for them. They've just got one extra property. Sometimes they can be accidental landlords because maybe they've inherited something and they haven't sold it, and actually what happens is the landlord loses interest, or there's something changes in their life circumstances, and they don't keep up with maintaining the property and all this kind of stuff. And actually the jeopardy of having somebody who's effectively an amateur landlord looking after you can be not great, and that can be part of the problem. So their answer to it was, well, can we professionalize the market, turn it into a proper industry where there are professional standards and this kind of thing. I think, to me, that seems to be forgotten a little bit, like, reforming that side of things, making it a more professional sector. I guess some of the stuff that Labour are proposing will do that. Again, I just don't see how you escape that moment where you have to have a fresh price discovery in terms of rents, of where this leads to, because of the investment that landlords will have to put back into their properties in order to bring them up to the right standards. So I think there's going to be disruption, whatever way you cut it, basically, which is not good for renters. Sorry, go on.
No, it's okay. That EPC thing is, so for people who don't know, that's your energy efficiency of your home. That's dangling over us. I think there's talk about making a bare minimum of that in terms of the wider green agenda here, which needs to be addressed. And that will have costs, and that will drive rents up. But also, I take your point about professionalisation, but, the corporate landlord definitely has benefits, I suppose. But also, I'm sort of thinking immediately, and maybe unfairly, about our water system and
profits.
Our trains.
Profits, Chris, you're talking about profits.
Yeah, well, profit, shameless profiteering happens in that regard, as well. And that has a negative impact for consumers as well. So I quite like the idea of, a human being at the end of the phone, accidental landlord or otherwise, who, but again, as I said, with my own personal experience, that all depends on the individual, and that can make it difficult when trying to set a series of standards that are going to protect people. So it's a difficult one. Plus, when you think about, how antiquated the UK housing market is, full stop, the property stock and all the kind of rules and regulations that go around with it, it's not going to be an easy fix, but they do need to tread carefully, I think. But on that, on your point about rents going up, I did see, while I was off, some interesting research came in from a company called Credibility, which caught my eye. So apparently they have seen that the average rent for a new let has risen 6.6% in the last year, UK-wide, to £1,226. And because of that, they are suggesting that it's more important now than ever to have a good credit score, to your point about professionalising things here, Ed, because this may be one of the things that they check on prospective new tenants when it comes to offering them the position of being able to live in the house. So they offer sort of some tips on how to go about that. But I thought that was really interesting. And being honest about your credit situation is one, considering using a guarantor, and then working on improving your credit score, obviously. And I was struck by how important credit scores generally as kind of an indicator of financial health are kind of creeping into other areas. It was before, and it remains obviously just a thing around borrowing. But also, if you start to see it more coming into to play in terms of other areas of your financial life, then it bears repeating. It's worth thinking more about things like registering on your electoral roll, paying your bills on time, looking to build your credit score by paying down outstanding debt, and checking your credit report for errors. And that's one of the things these guys do with Equifax. They offer sort of free credit score information and help when trying to improve the score. So I think more and more that's sort of another maybe hidden thing that perhaps renters aren't aware of, and that might be an area that you want to consider if you're thinking about changing your rental property in the near future, in terms of making sure your credit score is up to scratch. Because people are increasingly looking at that as a touch point.
Interesting. So the next topic that we were going to cover, again, this is a Labour agenda, I guess you'd call it, rather than specific policy that's coming down the tracks that isn't related to the budget. And this is again an important one, although it's one that we know slightly less about because they haven't actually published the bill yet. So unlike the renters reform stuff, we don't have specific information on it, but there has been kind of in the news in the past few days, there's wrangling going on between Labour and the unions. Obviously the unions have a big influence in kind of Labour policy, or at least some influence, and unions obviously as representative of workers are going to have a big say about this. So and that is on the issue of workers' rights. So I think the basic premise is that Labour want to improve workers' rights in terms of the potential policies that they could be bringing in. And again, we should see this in the next month or so. I think they said they were going to do something about it within the first 100 days, which gives us about a month. So it's restrictions on the use of zero-hour contracts, protection against unfair dismissal from day one, more coverage of statutory sick pay, a default right to flexible working, which I know is potentially a controversial one, and then other stuff. And this is the one that I like the most, because this brings out my comparison with France, which I'm gonna draw upon in a minute. Is the right to switch off, which I find quite an interesting one, particularly for the practical implications of that. So the right to switch off, Chris, is the ability to have working hours, and when those working hours end, tell your boss to go and stick it in his pipe and smoke it if he's got a request. So obviously some quite controversial stuff there, potentially. Well, I don't know what your thoughts are on it, Chris. Well, I've got some very, very specific thoughts.
Well, the switch off thing's interesting. I think my employer encourages that. Well, not to tell them to go stick anything. That's but occasionally things happen in the news agenda that happen outside hours. So we're aware that we need to kind of respond to that. But generally, it's good for the longevity and health of your workers to switch off from time to time, well, most of the time, at the right points. So I think if you're a forward-thinking employer, and a lot of the ones that I come across in terms of clients and other big things then you see the benefit of that anyway. Again, it all depends on the nature of the work that you're doing, and so creating some kind of top-down solution to that feels quite difficult. And are those the industries that are being exploited? In the Amazon warehouse, for example, the right to kind of switch off, is that doesn't feel like it's more kind of.
Yeah, I mean, that kind of stuff I would imagine is probably not relevant, is it? Because you clock in. I mean, I worked in my first ever job actually was working in a warehouse, and you clock in at 8 a.m. You do your hours, and then you clock out, kind of thing. And you literally have like a thing that you clock in and clock out with, like proper old school factory style. I don't know if they do it these days, but I did. So that kind of, I mean, it is more for kind of the your office worker who's getting emails at 9 o'clock at night from their boss who wants to get a deal over the line and that kind of thing. But I think so. You touched upon it there, in that one of the bigger criticisms from the business side of stuff is that this doesn't account for the nuances of every different business that is out there in the country, in the economy. Different businesses operate differently. They have different needs and requirements and this kind of thing. It's very hard to tell what the impact of these kind of increased workers' rights would be. And so, in some senses, it'd be good for some people. On the downside, and where this can affect people's personal finances, and this is where I'm going to draw on the French comparison, is much of the stuff that's been touted by Labour and by kind of policy wonks and this kind of thing. You can compare it against the kind of how the French economy works and how French workers have their rights. So the French have the right to switch off. That was kind of, I think it came through a few years ago, or I can't remember how long ago. And a lot of these reforms are modelled on making us more similar in terms of the employment market, the labour market, to France. But if you look at the French economy, there are some clear differences with employment levels. So French workers are more productive than British workers, which I think is quite interesting. So that means that French produce more in 1 hour of labour than an equivalent British worker, which is interesting.
Mm.
The next thing that's interesting is that in France, 69% of adults have a job, whereas in the UK, I should say, the figure is 75%. And unemployment is also higher in France, so that means the interpretation of what that means is slightly difficult with unemployment, because you have people who are don't have a job but aren't looking for one. So I think that's kind of people looking for a job. So all that to be said, the problem here is, if we increase workers' rights, are we going to see a rise in unemployment? Because it's going to make employers think, well, if we have these workers who have higher levels of employment rights, is it worth us employing this person if we then maybe want to get rid of them, but we can't because of these enhanced rights? So that would be my concern with this is that it could increase unemployment, basically. It could create a situation where companies not necessarily get rid of people because of the new rights. I don't think that will necessarily happen, especially if they make it more difficult to get fired, for people to get fired or removed. What it could happen is it could create a hiring crunch, basically. I mean, and we've already had a bit of slowdown in the market for hiring anyway, but
yeah.
So yeah, so I mean that's kind of, I guess, leave listeners with their own thoughts about that.
Well, it does just outline the challenge that we're at, and we're in a bit of a funk. We need to break out of it. Like I think we said before, I've heard before that the economy isn't broken, but it's stuck in second gear kind of thing. So how do you kind of get moving? Well, you are going to have to change some things around. And obviously, broadly speaking, increasing workers' rights, I think, has to be seen as a good thing. But my concern is that it's not necessarily in the kind of areas that you're talking about it there that the focus should be. I'm worried about things like the gig economy, making sure that people have rights and aren't being exploited in that regard. 0-hour contracts, not a big fan of those from what I've seen. Having never been on one, but from what I hear about them, they don't seem to me to be a forward-thinking, sustainable UK economy should be built upon. Not entirely built upon.
Yeah, so the 0-hour contract thing is actually interesting, because unions aren't against 0-hour contracts. Unions are happy to have 0-hour contracts where the worker gets to decide if they have the 0-hour contract, if that makes sense. So they
yes.
Because in some cases, having a 0-hour contract for somebody who wants to just take on hours when they have time for it, that's kind of fine. It's like, I'm associated with this employer. They don't give me a guaranteed set of work per week, but obviously they're going to, be like, hey, can you come in? We've got 3 hours of work today. Okay, great. Yeah, no, I'm free. I can come in. So where the right and the balance of the relationship is the worker deciding whether they want to go and do it or not, then the unions, I think, see it as not a bad thing. But I agree, where it's kind of the employer dictating, no, you get 3 hours this week and that's it. Sorry.
It's also the fire and rehire thing is just abhorrent as far as I'm concerned. It just feels wrong on every level in terms of the kind of society that we want to live in. You want sustainable companies making a profit. I think Rachel Reeves has said that she's committed to kind of being pro-business. I think need to be in the world that we live in, but also people do need that little bit of security. And firing and rehiring people on 0 hours contracts, which was a bit of a thing a few years ago. I hear less about it now. Just isn't part of a sustainable workforce in that regard. So yeah, I take your point. In certain situations where people want to sort of dip their toe into the labour market in less restrictive fashion, and that's fine. So, but it just needs to be protections against that fire and rehire policy thing.
One of the more interesting, so I'll finish on this, one of the more interesting theories I've seen recently about how the struggles with our labour market, and particularly with the productivity issues, is it came down, and why, when you compare it with the US has such a much stronger economy at the moment, and what has done. I mean, things apparently slowing down a bit now. It came down to the way in which the US and the UK differed on their furlough schemes during the pandemic. And I found this very interesting.
Okay.
So in the UK, obviously, we all remember we had the furlough scheme, and what that was Rishi Sunak saying that they'd guarantee everybody's wages up to, what was it, about 75% of their wages, or $2,000 or something like that.
Rings a bell.
Anyway, to stop people getting, laid off, or fired en masse because of what was happening in the pandemic. So everybody basically got paid to be on the Everybody went on the furlough scheme, got paid to be on the bench, and then went back to their jobs once things opened back up again. In the US, they did it in a really different way. They waited for companies to fire people, and then they massively increased the unemployment benefit. So instead of having all of these employees on the bench not doing anything, getting paid furlough money, they had unemployed people looking for work, but otherwise on the dole, basically, but on a very, very high level dole, like, big dole, so that they didn't have any real financial, weren't as fraught financially. Now, the outcome of this is when the pandemic came to an end, what happened in the US was a massive race to reorganize the employment economy, and everybody, businesses, employees, all looking for a more efficient job that they could do, a better job. So if businesses were like, okay, what do we need? Let's hire these people. This is what we need. This is the wages we need to pay. Employees are all kind of, what kind of job do I want to do? Obviously, the employment market's really good because everybody's looking for employees. So what do I want? What's going to be good for me? And this led to a really, really healthy reorganization of the market, of the labor market.
Mm.
And in the UK, everybody just went back to these jobs that they'd been doing before the pandemic, and there were nothing got fixed in terms of the labor market, the productivity issues, people being in low-paying jobs that they're stuck in, or people doing jobs that aren't economically efficient, and all this kind of stuff. And I find that, I don't know how much evidence there is to support it. I definitely, again, I'll try and find a source for that one. But I found that really, really interesting, that you can have two momentary decisions made at the same time to deal with the same problem, but the potential outcomes of it are very different. And it's left the UK economy suffering for years afterwards, while the US are just kind of absolutely powered on post-pandemic and had a really good time, basically.
Yeah, I suppose it's the ripping the plaster off as opposed to doing it slowly, and we're kind of doing it slowly, and there's a bit of continued pain there. Yeah, I'll be interested to see the source of that, Ed. And yeah, I think there'll be a few of these sort of sliding doors moments when it comes to pandemic decisions that will come to light as more water goes under the bridge. So we could one to compare and contrast.
Now, just to finish off the episode today, we've talked about it quite a bit, because both, as mentioned at the start of the episode, Chris and I are both dads now. Chris twice over. Chris, that's got you thinking about something quite important, hasn't it? What has it got you thinking about?
Yeah, I think I've mentioned this before, but I weirdly obsess over JISAs. My Instagram now, just to give everyone a flavour of what's going on here, is full of don't put your kid the wrong way in a car seat, otherwise you'll immediately kill them. Here's how to burp your child effectively, which is actually proven quite helpful. And the other thing I'm getting a lot of from a lot of influencers: open a junior ISA. By the time they're 60, they'll be millionaires. And I have to admit that works on me. Although I'm already, as we know, very much pro junior ISA. Having worked with companies who do it, like Scottish Friendly, I definitely understand the ins and outs of it, and in terms of why it's a good thing and why it works. But yeah, I've come across a compound interest calculator. So I was having a little look at. So I've got, for my first daughter, she's 3.5. I've got about 4,700 quid in her JISA as it stands. So I've tried to up my contributions into that to get it to around 150, 200 pounds a month. I'm looking at the if over the next 15 years we continue at that pace and consider 8% growth per year, which I don't think is unreasonable in the investment markets, but I'm not an investment expert, and I'm sure there'll be ups and downs around that. For 150 quid a month, she'd end up with £53,596. And then at £200 a month, she'd have close on 70k when she hit 80, which, with inflation might not be as much as it is now by the time 2040 rolls around. But having said that, I do think that's not a bad start in life. The one thing that I think has come up when we talked about it, where we may slightly differ, is that when they turn 18, they can get their hands on the money, right? And then I'm sure they'll be spending it on vapes and backpacking holidays rather than what they should be doing, which is, putting it towards their education and saving for a property, because we all know how hard that is on this So yeah, you have a different view, don't you?
So yeah, this is
Scrooge.
my exact bone to pick with the junior ISA is that the day my son turns 18, he can do with it what he likes, and I am far more Machiavellian than to allow something like that to happen. So, well, you showed me the Instagram post, and I found it was interesting. The numbers were interesting, where you get to 18 and you got 50 grand or whatever, but if you get to 57, they have more than a million quid.
Yes.
But if we're thinking in those terms, then I have an answer for you, Chris.
Which is
start a pension for your child.
Well, they do offer them. They do offer them.
Don't let them have a choice at 18. I know what I was like at 18. Actually, I was quite responsible at 18, so this is maybe not a good example. I know what some people are like at 18.
You went into being a personal finance journalist, so I should hope that you were somewhat responsible.
At age 18, actually, to be fair, at age 18, I was there was a lot of desire for backpacking going on, and a lot of my money did get spent on that. To be fair,
that's not a waste of money, though, in my eyes. And this is what goes against your pension thing.
No, but I
want them to travel the world if they want to.
I went and worked in a factory in order to save money up to go and do that, Chris. That's the difference.
So did I. I did the same thing on building sites. So you have got a point.
So look, I'll tell you what we're doing. We haven't set up a junior ISA. The principal reason for that is because, and this is actually what for me it comes down to, the main reason I haven't set up a junior ISA is because I don't need to, because I don't fill my own ISA subscription every year. So we are putting money aside for him, but we're just doing it in our own ISA for now. If one day we strike it rich and we do start filling our own ISAs, which between me and my wife is £40,000 a year, mind you, then I'll start contributing to a junior ISA in order to maximise the tax efficiency of all of it. I also think we will probably do something like start a pension, because even if you're only throwing like 20 quid a month in that, after he's 50, 50 years old, and he's not even 1 year old at the moment, it will make him, a huge amount of money just because of the sheer amount of time you're giving him to do it. That's, I think, the route we'd go down. And then when it comes to things like, when you turn 18, you want a car or you want to go to uni or whatever, there are ways to make those decisions that I don't think require a cash fund, and I think the world will be different by then as well. I don't think, the calculations you make today about that sort of stuff will necessarily be the same. So, yeah, I'm hedging a little bit.
Sorry, do you mean they'll be more expensive, or they'll be...
No, I think
that money will be less.
I mean, personally, I think things like university education will be less desirable in 20 years' time. I don't think it'll be the same, because the cost of the cost of education now, when I went to uni, it was what, $3,000 a year or something like that. Probably the same for you.
Yeah, it was, yeah.
But, the amount of debt that they walk away with, and I know it's not proper debt, but even still, a 9% income tax levy, which I am still paying. I left uni more than a decade ago, and I was only paying $3,000 a month. But the amount of interest that the stupid thing has accrued means that it's taken absolutely ages to pay it down, and that still curtails 9% of my income every month, which is not a small amount of money.
No,
that's enough money that it could pay for, childcare or whatever for him,
or go into your own pension,
go into my own pension, exactly, all that kind of stuff. So the amount of debt that people go to go to university, I think should, and I think it is creating much more of a pause for, is it worth it? Or is there another way that we can pay for it that doesn't mean taking on tuition fee debt and that kind of thing?
So my point on, I think the child pension is a good idea, but I want the flexibility to be built into it so that by the time they hit 18, they do have options to spend it on other things. I take your point. I certainly also am not hitting my ISA limit and could save within my own ISA for both my daughters. However, there's something about the demarcation of it that makes it easier for me to do that. Because if that all got lost in one sort of homogenous blob of money, then all of a sudden I find it's slowly draining away on the latest issue that we've got, or that kind of thing. So I do feel the need to have that demarcation and have them separate, and also be able to track them as individual things. So maybe it's just a way that I approach my money, but having those separate ring-fenced things has helped me a lot, I think, in terms of discipline. So
it's the sense of self-sacrifice for your kids, Chris. That's what it comes down to.
That is me being a martyr. That's what
Christianity.
I need to see what
it all comes back to Christianity.
Let's not get started on that. It's
sorry
too late for that. But,
we're a money podcast.
Yeah. We're a money podcast. Yeah. But I think there is. Yeah. I do feel good. I do feel good looking at that, and those projections make me feel good. And the idea of being able to give my daughters a start. The only ethical bringing them back to Christianity is: do you tell them about it? If you don't want them blowing it when they're 18, you just say there's this thing you need to put money into. Don't ask any questions, and then by the time you're 30, you have another look. But I'm hoping that getting into good habits myself and learning finance, and maybe they'll get educated in school as well. That would be nice, because I definitely wasn't, and had to learn money as I got into my 20s and like that, and making some mistakes on the way. I was always prudent, but making a couple of wrong turns here and there, maybe starting things a bit too late. Maybe this will create a different sense of responsibility.
It's like creating that sense of hardship, and then it comes to the end. It's like, that was a test, son, and you passed. Congratulations. Here is your £1 million JISA account that I didn't tell you about.
Fingers crossed someone's going to do that for me when I turn 65.
I'm still waiting for my dad to do that for me, if he's listening, just in case.
Well, we'll forward him the episode and see if that sparks him into finally revealing the truth.
Right, we've had a bit of a good chat today, I think, Chris. I'm going to draw a very sensible line under it there. Chris, thank you for joining me again.
My pleasure.
Nice to have you back. And thank you, everybody, for listening as ever. You can catch us on Spotify, Apple, YouTube, and don't forget to follow us on places like TikTok and Instagram, on X. And don't forget to sign up to the Mouthy Money newsletter and have a read of the website for everything coming up every day. So with that, thanks, everybody, and goodbye.